What if I told you that the Rodecaster Pro was not the first podcasting interface to hit the market? Would you be even more shocked to hear that one was released 3 years prior to the original Rodecaster Pro? And further to that, it cost way less than what the Rodecaster Pro would launch at. But then, if all of that is true, why haven't you heard about this, the Tascam Mini Studio Creator US42B? That name is just mwah. For starters, it's probably something to do with that name. So bad. Now, up until the Rodecaster Pro was released, there was really no such thing as a podcasting interface. There were just, interfaces. You could do all the things with a regular old interface or board that a podcasting interface could do, just a whole bunch of learning first. And part of the reason it took so long for a podcast interface to be universally recognized is actually a bit of a complex discussion. But mostly, it's due to the snobby, to be frank, elitist culture surrounding a lot of audio gear. And companies at the time were aware of that culture and tried valiantly to appease both the elitist and the newcomers. But at the time, it wasn't something that was always possible. Anything listed as affordable or user-friendly was viewed as less than, and never really gained respect. Even the original Scarlet series got lambasted on message boards as not being pro enough for audio recording, a sentiment that has thankfully been lost to time. And honestly, it actually took a premium build and super friendly UI like the Rodecaster Pro to finally break through. And let's not forget that price tag. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the Mini Studio Creator US42B and perhaps glean some knowledge as to why it failed. Now, this unit is actually completely on brand for the era it was released in. Got a full plastic body, but honestly, not the worst plastic that I've seen on a unit. The knobs, they feel good. But the XLR jacks do have quite a bit of play in them, though the rest of the jacks are fine, including the USB. The switches as well have a decent feel to them and a nice click when you're changing your settings. The meter on this is actually quite good for the time it was released as well, though it hasn't aged well when put up against some of the more granular meters on newer podcast interfaces. And those pads, they feel fantastic, giving you the same feel and vibes that you got on the updated boards. As for the features on the unit, well, you have an aux on the front, mainly for the older phones that used to have TRRS jacks on them. Also a loopback switch on the front that allows you to monitor computer audio as well. On the back, you have analog outs, which is an interesting addition, though with this being developed before 2015, I can kind of see that. Power switch, USB connection, USB-B by the way, and a separate power USB in for when you aren't connected to a computer. Also, the included program, which by the way you do have to install as it's packaged with the drivers, is actually pretty good. Easy to use, but also ridiculously in depth when you dip into the advanced settings, something we're going to talk about in a bit. All in all though, from a build and feature perspective, this thing's pretty decent. All right, let's get the wheels off a little bit with the specs. This thing is a 2-in and 4-out interface. Kind of. It's 24-bit, 96 kilohertz, which is actually impressive. 42 dB of gain, USB 2.0, USB micro for the supplementary power, and finally, an EIN of neg 120 dBUA weighted. Ouch. So with this being a relatively solid piece of gear, especially for the era it was released, how the hell did this thing fall through the cracks for most people? Well, it's more than just one single fact, and while Tascam actually kind of hit it out of the park back then, there are a few issues that didn't age well. The best way to see where Tascam fell short, we can just compare it to the Rodecaster Pro, as it was the first super successful podcasting interface. And first up is simplicity. Now, this thing really does dumb down audio a lot, but you can see Tascam wasn't ready to completely deliver this to the uneducated masses. Remember, at the time, anything less than professional quality and teaming with complex controls and high-end specs would be shunned by the overall audio community. So this was Tascam kind of walking the line. It's the little things like advanced controls that kind of sink this thing. The learning curve between the one-button approach and the advanced tab is a chasm when comparing it to the controls on the Rodecaster Pro. The second issue it had was in specs. Now, the original Rodecaster Pro wasn't a massive lock for specs either, launching without multi-track drivers. Even when it did initially get them, it was still just third-party trash drivers that diminished the luster of the unit. But at least Rode listened and updated their unit consistently. The EIN of the original Rodecaster Pro was also lackluster at only neg 125 dBu A-weighted. It's still a far cry from the neg 120 dBu A-weighted of the Tascam. That 5 dB is a massive differential. And don't get me wrong, there is still generational improvements in the 2 years between the units, but even for 2016, that EIN is rather high, almost as if podcasters weren't worth the lower noise. Which leads us into the final reason, and I kind of touched on it there. Updates. Rode committed themselves and plenty of resources to the Rodecaster Pro. They put money behind it and rode that pony hard. Tom Buck. Hey, Tom. Yeah, oh, sorry. I'll stay in my lane. All right, bye. Man, he's kind of grumpy for a punny fella. Rode had a development team on it from day one, listening to the user base and expanding their unit with features month over month. And Tascam? Well, they didn't. In fact, they dropped all updates as soon as the Rodecaster Pro came out, which I think is kind of the saddest part of this story. You see, the Rodecaster Pro was a relatively expensive piece of gear, and we were still some time away from getting more affordable units like the Podtrak P4. Tascam had a window there to ramp up their marketing of this much cheaper unit and try to grab some of that market share from the people that couldn't afford the Rodecaster. Instead, they ended up going back to the drawing board and came up with the Mixcast 4. It's still a great unit, don't get me wrong. It was just a touch late. Now, this is where the disappointment does really kind of set in. It does work in the general sense, but as I mentioned, they stopped updates on the unit in 2019, meaning this thing doesn't really work with Windows 11. I mean, it was released in the middle of the last decade, and the drivers are supported by Windows 7 and 8. So if that's your studio setup, cool, this might be for you. But it goes even deeper than that. I use Adobe Audition, and the CC version doesn't even recognize the ASIO drivers for this. It recognizes it, but it can't tell if the device is activated. That said, you can still use it with MME drivers, though the multi-track functionality is gone at that point. But this thing is still being sold by Tascam, which actually really annoys me. If you're still selling the product, why does it not work with the most recent operating system? I've tweeted at them to try to get an answer, and I got nothing back. So I'm actually reaching out to them personally, but I'm not holding my breath. Now, it's really cool to think of what might have been with this thing. When Tascam released this, there was a development window open for them to start working on the next generation. Had they seen the light and perhaps sold a few more of these to prove the concept, we might be on the second Tascam Mixcast rather than the Rodecaster. And this is the power of research and development too. Paying attention to trends and serving the customer weighs in there as well. For now though, perhaps I should warn you, just stay away from this unit if you see it for sale. While it is a really cool piece of history, the lack of updates has rendered this thing less effective than the Podtrak P4. So if you want some of that functionality with a whole bunch more gain while saving yourself a buttload of cash, buy the P4, which I reviewed right up here. Cheers.